Creating a list of the most overlooked games of 2017 is both easy and difficult at the same time. This year has been a landmark one for the gaming world, and while a lot of people claim that every year, all you have to do is look at the biggest games released to realize that yeah, this year has been one KO punch game after another. I mean, to be perfectly honest with you, I'm sort of beginning to really worry. There's so much talent out there in the industry right now that you can end up missing a lot of pretty good games on a weekly basis. Not monthly, mind you, weekly. It makes the job of people like me, even if I'm not doing this full time, that much more important. So rather than give a summary of the year, let's just get right into it. These are my overlooked games of 2017. Now the criteria this year is a lot more flexible than prior years due to the fact that again, my time was limited. I spent a good amount of the last few weeks looking for the games that were missed, but the idea here is simple. These are games that I didn't think get the sales that they deserved based on their quality. Games with lower sales were focused on and time with them were taken into account. So while a game like Finding Paradise may be overlooked in the big picture, the fact that it has 50,000 sales in less than a month knocked it out of my contenders, the games that I wanted to focus on. And when I mean that, I mean I didn't even look at it because it was that packed of a year. So what made the cut? Come find out with me. And maybe pick up a game or two to help it out. Number 10. Subsurface Circular. From the mind of the guy behind Valium and Thomas Was Alone comes a game that tells an interesting story involving a future with robots and humans. You play as a detective robot that is looking into the disappearance of another robot's friend. Now there isn't that much to the gameplay element here due to it being like a visual novel. You have to determine what your next step is by asking the right question of the right robots in the room that you are in. And it only has a few puzzles and relies on your detective work, which is really just asking questions. But pure gameplay is not what you're here for. You're here for the story. Which, okay, it's a story that you've probably heard before. People mysteriously going missing in the future, the idea of robots versus humans, the idea of free thought. The dystopian future writing subject has its themes and sticks to them, and Subsurface Circular has a good amount of them. Yet, it feels somewhat different thanks to the story's presentation here. The idea of people coming to you and you never moving from your spot on the train puts you at a different perspective. And playing from the robot perspective does feel a bit interesting this go around. Especially because in this world, robots are assigned specific roles, and the ideas of classes and divisions within the robots and humans is well explored here. The atmosphere is what makes this game work, as the tone of not knowing exactly what's going on, but seemingly always one step away from the truth, just makes you want to go out and try to find that missing piece. Something about the presentation here too enhances that, as the small differences in robot structure and toned down colors seem to add to the mystery more than anything else. Good subtle sound design also helps this, providing things like the sound of a train hitting the tracks and little keys elsewhere. Now, it's not higher on this list for one reason. The format of the writing is rather hit or miss. For 70% of people, it'll hit and be just fine, but that 30% will hate the way it's structured. So it's a good thing you can refund it if it doesn't hit you within the first 30 minutes. But either way, it's a good story with an interesting perspective, and you know that I've gotta love those. Number 9. Wonder Boy: The Dragon's Trap. Next we have a game that rests on a bit of nostalgia, which you may look at the screen and go, wait, what? This doesn't have any pixel artwork. What are you talking about nostalgia? Okay, that's not all nostalgia is, but give me a second here. A bit more representative of your expectations when I say nostalgia, right? Wonder Boy: The Dragon's Trap is a remake of an old Sega Master System game that you may not have ever heard of. Dotemu and Lizard Cube have taken that older game and put a more modern coat of paint on it. And let's get it out of the way. The presentation is the draw for this game, with a good use of color and some really good background work. Actually, the background artist is probably the star of the show here, as the layer of depth he adds to the world, with roots coming out of the ground in this background, for example, really comes through, despite it not being the full focus. It's also complemented with some good line work on the enemies to make them stand out from the background, although they should have used cool and warm color schemes a little bit better, despite the really good vivid designs here. However, I don't want to hold that against the game entirely, as it is trying to emulate the original game, and if the original's nostalgia factor has that flaw, it's hard to just turn that off and ignore it, because it's part of that original game. As for the gameplay, it's simple action platforming that doesn't necessarily stand out from its brethren in the genre, but it gets the job done. Not to say that it doesn't have a little bit of difficulty to it either. It can punish you if you're not careful with the characters and are reckless with moving around. The controls do take some getting used to, but work well for the enemy placement and the gameplay styles they are going for here. It also never lets you get too comfortable either, thanks to its gimmick, that you change characters every so often, completely changing up your skills and your attack ranges and style. It's also the right length for those sections too, sticking on a character just long enough to test your skills with a boss fight, but not staying around too long for it to get boring. The game only reaches number 9 on this list because, well, you can get other experiences like this at a cheaper price or more substantial content if you overlook this presentation. Regardless, it's a game that I would recommend for those looking for a more traditional nostalgic experience, or people who want something pretty to look at. Number 8. She Remembered Caterpillars. Next is a nice little puzzle game from Jumpsuit Entertainment. She Remembers Caterpillars is simple. You have to get your colored creatures to the appropriate exit. That's it. There are of course hazards that you have to work through, such as gates that will block certain colors from going through them. The game does a good job in this puzzle element to introduce new mechanics and teach them through its early scenarios, and then remixes those elements smartly to force you to take your initial understanding to the next level. It also doesn't stick on a mechanic for longer than it needs to in my initial hours with the game. It stays around long enough for you to understand while not making it feel repetitive. I have to give the game props for hitting a really good difficulty level. Now, I'm a fan of extremely hair-tearing out puzzles in my focused puzzle games. I like being challenged, but I recognize that the frustration level for those types of games can really turn off a lot of people to the genre. She Remembered Caterpillars, however, never felt frustrating, despite the fact that the difficulty can be pretty head-scratching at times. Something about the simplicity of these mechanics and the small tools that the game gives you helps out so much, to the point where I felt relaxed. In addition, it's also accessible in other ways. Specifically, the game's color scheme would initially suggest that it may not be accessible for colorblind people. But colorblind players will notice that each character has a unique shape, meaning that even 5% of the world's population still will be able to play this game with no problems. In fact, the art as a whole is one of the game's strengths, as it brings me a calm to balance out some of its tougher levels. It's simple yet effective, drawing attention to the right things gameplay-wise without overshadowing the overall work. In addition, the game actually has a story that makes you think and reflect on your own life as well. It's touching and not in your face with its messages, but more so to just sit back and go, never thought of it that way. The only reason that it's lower on this list is that its replay value is lower due to the structure of its puzzles, and the 40+ puzzles may be low for some at its normal price of $12. With that said, it's a game that sticks around just enough to make an impact, and for some it may be a sale title, and that's fine, but it's good nonetheless. Number 7. Gravity Rush 2. For those who have come to expect my yearly overlooked games list, this choice may seem like a real oddity. Not only is it bigger than the normal indie games that populate this list, it seems to break my normal number conventions in terms of qualifications. Based on an article by Gravity Rush Central on February 26, 2017, the number of users in Gravity Rush 2 who had Dusky tokens was 168,868, which means that, well, that is at least the number of copies that are owned by the general public. So, if it's over 100K, how the hell does it qualify for this list? Well, to be frank, if I was able to keep my normal schedule and do this full time, it wouldn't have been. But the core reason behind this list every year is simple: to highlight games that were overlooked by the general player base and media. My prior rules aside, Gravity Rush 2 strongly falls into that category due to the unique experience that it brings to the table. There are only a handful of games that allow you to feel like a flying superhero like Gravity Rush 2 does. Once you get a hold of the controls and start to understand how to move Cat around, you can feel like a high-wire trapeze artist, showing off a visual ballet of kicks while pummeling your enemies. The secondary skills that the game adds helps the combat a lot, as the ability to throw chairs and other random shit at enemies never got old, at least in my mind. Targeting here takes a good amount of precision and yet doesn't feel too clunky. While enemy variety is lower than some may want, the sheer angles and approaches you can take helps keep the game's variety high enough for the long haul. It also helps that this world is just fun to be in, flying around and seeing the different architectures and the world that Toyama built here. And when I mean world, I mean world. As in, the game takes influences from French and European structures and constructed this world around the idea of flying in the sky, but making it relatable with real-life elements. You could see this world easily existing, even with the technology in place today. Hell, this game has its own language, having the main character Cat sing a song entirely in that language, which is of course really beautiful. The story is good with a few good main characters, and in particular the dynamic between Raven and Cat, and the music is heavenly and is a must-buy for anyone needing some light listening music. The reason it's this low on the list is what I said before. It did at least sell 100,000 copies, and it did get noticed by some niche sites dedicated to more specialized Japanese titles. But to me, that's not enough. Not for a game this well done. Number 6. Juanito Arcade Mayhem. The Pang genre is always one that consistently gets overlooked in my mind. People seem to always think it's too simple compared to games in the shoot-'em-up genre, due to its limitations of one direction and the way it generally moves. But simplicity is sometimes the best formula for fun, as there's a reason people still play games like Galaga and Space Invaders, cause shooting shit is fun, and sometimes all the mechanisms and gameplay extras in the world can end up overcomplicating that feeling. That's not to say that Juanito here is simple. It just focuses on a small amount of gameplay mechanics to get the job done. In fact, the amount of power-ups and weapons in the game are extremely limited, which may sound like a recipe for a game that runs out of variety quickly. However, the game plays expertly to its themes of retro video games like Tetris and Breakout, with smart mechanisms to force you to react quickly or lose one of your limited lives. Small things like the platform you see here that Juanito is standing on can vastly change how you play a level, as using it to juggle enemies above you and manage the battlefield is extremely important in these sets of levels. In addition, the monsters reset when they fall into the pit below you here, coming from above. This forces you to adapt to a game that takes a surprising amount of strategy if you want to 3-star each level. Each level set feels vastly different from the next, while retaining the same core gameplay and mechanics. So if you think you're gonna get bored here, you got another thing coming. Let's not overlook the art direction here either, as while Cuphead has defined the bar for the indie market for years to come in that category, Juanito takes a solid silver. Animations are solid, and it feels like a more modern Saturday morning cartoon with its visuals. It's crisp, it's clean, and really lovely to look at, as the game flows very well with the gameplay programmed here. The art gives the game its character, something that makes me think of its other brethren in the indie pang genre, the Bug Butcher. But don't be fooled here. You've got two very separate games here that offer very distinct experiences in the genre, and I'd strongly recommend both games to anyone who wants a bit of straightforward reactionary fun. Number 5. Tooth and Tail. Fans of the channel may notice that there's one genre that I don't really cover, and that's the RTS genre. You'd think that somebody who loves strategy would be all over it, as it could be a battle of wits and a chess-like match. But something usually doesn't click with it for me. Something about the gameplay and the aggression versus defensive always seems to give me a problem, even though I know I should be able to wrap my mind around it. Yet, that didn't seem to be the case for Tooth and Tail, despite the fact it's actually very similar to those other games in the genre. Yet that doesn't seem to be the case for Tooth and Tail, despite the fact that it's actually very similar to those other games. Something about the simplified controls and in-game UI really appeals to me versus every other game in the genre, and I wondered, what's different here? And I thought about that and wondered, why? Why is it like that? Well, one of my friends on Steam, the Small C Critic, said it best. What Skullgirls did for fighting games, Tooth and Tail does for the RTS genre, by cutting out a lot of the fat and just focusing on key elements at the basic level, but adding some other elements that make things more interesting. For example, the idea of the cursor being the character is huge, and actually makes me interact with the game a lot more actively, and yet does affect the strategy element when it comes to positioning and the run cycle that it takes to get across the map. The shorter match length on average is key here too. It makes every action feel worthwhile and purposeful, and doesn't force matches longer than they really need to be. Only having one resource keeps things simple, like I said, but I like how buying troops and building new farms to make more food makes that strategy element even more engaging. Units have variety and different strengths, but they aren't necessarily complicated like other RTSs in the genre. They were easy to understand what each unit did and how it affected the battle without a lot of explanation. The campaign does a great job of teaching all the mechanics and keeping you entertained with its missions and its length. But the multiplayer is where the game is really at, from a casual to regionally competitive perspective. The only reason that this game isn't higher on the list is simple. I've only played a couple of hours of it, and compared to the other games on this list that I put more time into, it's hard for me to say if it's going to hold up at the 10, 20, 30 hour mark, even though people that I respect seem to have loved the game, like ACG. But honestly, if this game by itself can get me more interested in the genre going forward, that's saying something. And that makes it definitely worth a pickup. Number 4. Hand of Fate 2. I actually feel somewhat bad for putting Hand of Fate 2 on this list, and that's for one reason. I started looking at the game when it first came out, and I have not made a video on it yet. Look, the last 2 months have been incredibly busy from a real life perspective, but honestly, this game is good. Really, really good. To the point where a first view for me turned into a first impressions, and will turn into a full review that I'm still working on. It deserves more in-depth coverage, because the game is pretty much fantastic. Hand of Fate 2 takes everything that was great about the first version of the game, and just adds layers upon layers onto it. Sure, the combat is pretty similar to the first game, mimicking a simple form of the Arkham Asylum Assassin's Creed combat system. Weapon and enemy types fall into standard categories in a slightly more complicated rock, paper, scissors type system. It's simple, and if it was only this thing that was holding together Hand of Fate, it wouldn't be able to distinguish itself from the rest of the pack. But no, the real draw here is the card and storytelling system that comes from those cards. Constructing an adventure to go on with the cards that you unlock shuffled in with the stranger's cards never gets old. The idea of your hero going on a unique adventure coming right from the tabletop is awesome. It's great storytelling that works despite the sheer number of scenarios that you can get into. These different scenarios all have certain outcomes and strengths and weaknesses that you can really maximize, and strategy is so key in some of the more difficult scenarios. And what's awesome is that there's a couple of ways of doing them and still being successful. My favorite scenario, the strength scenario, is the prime example. You start off with barely any health, and you can't gain health through eating food like in other scenarios. There's also certain challenges that are more prevalent in this scenario, particularly dice challenges. So, when I construct my deck, I have to make a lot of decisions. What companion do I take? The one that can protect me in fights with his magic, or the one who can get me past those dice challenges easier? Both are legitimate strategies. Do I load up on defensive armor, or do I try to stuff more healing options in my cards? Do I focus on getting more gold to be more flexible with my options? The way you can play this game are numerous, and I love it for that. Really, the only reason this isn't higher on the list is because I do think it got good coverage from bigger YouTubers, and despite the sales not being there entirely, the game does have a good word of mouth out there. Nevertheless, it's very close on my scale of a must-buy in my scoring system for my full review. And that's saying something. I don't give that score out a lot, and for the games that I do, yeah, there's a reason why they're must-buys. Number 3. Fight and Rage. Hey, remember Streets of Rage? Remember Double Dragon? Remember beat-em-ups in general? Fight and Rage is the modern-day version of them. And yet, for some reason, I haven't seen a whole lot of beat-em-ups in general, even from the indie scene. At least not ones as well done like this game from Seba Games Dev. A tight set of controls and movement means that you have to execute your gameplay here precisely if you want to get through the game without using any continues or losing any lives. Combos here are simple but effective, with the right set of ranges to deal with the variety of enemies, meaning that yes, you'll have to get close to actually hit them, and not just sort of poke them from afar. In general, crowd control is one of the best things about Fight and Rage. It brings back the panic of some of the best beat-em-ups I've played, where you'd get surrounded and wouldn't know what to do until you got the experience and how to manage your enemies. The game really brings back nostalgia, that's for sure. But what's also interesting here are the little additions that they've made to the gameplay. The special meter, for example. It has a time-based element to it on a single use, but it allows you to use it on cooldown with sacrificing a little bit of health to give you some real options in battle. Yes, prior games did only the health thing, but this time element makes things a little bit more interesting strategy-wise. Overall, the variety of this gameplay is strong, as there are 3 different initial characters you start with that all feel distinct and have very different playstyles. Not just special move differences, mind you, but literally, the combos and everything about them feels vastly different. But the real reason this game ends up at number 3 on this list is how everything feels to play. The animations and graphics have a certain style to them, hitting a nice in-between of older pixel graphics and real fighting motions that seem modern and more fluid. Those fighting elements are so satisfying in their execution, especially when you get combos going and execute them so well that you turn an enemy to bones while doing it. I mean, look at that. That is glorious, and it gives an adrenaline-like rush every time it happens. Like, you've really done well here. The CRT presentation brings back moments of nostalgia as well, and the music keeps your energy up and wanting to beat up the next set of goons. And yes, the game has a unique set of physics to keep certain people's interest up. Fight and Rage is the pure arcade game that you could spend hours and hours and hours mastering. And with the amount of unlockables here, that time will be well spent. The only thing that would suck for some is that there's no online co-op to really push the game to the elite level. However, the one developer, and I mean one developer, has polished everything to a sheen here. So I think that sitting around and playing with friends in real life is an easy sacrifice to make to play this game. And while some will look at the price tag and scoff considering other games out there, I'm here to tell you that this game is a must-buy at full price. It's that darn polished. Number 2, Cryptarch. 57,000 people. Only 57,000 people have bought Cryptarch, and that's a goddamn shame. Now look, is it a Game of the Year candidate? No, I can't say that, because there's way too many good games this year. But Cryptarch is a game that is the prime example of doing things right in early access. It started with a solid game, with a great set of gameplay mechanics and content from the get-go, and then added little things along the way, while balancing and taking community feedback. Cryptarch is from the twin-stick shooter, roguelike, and roguelite genre, and it stands out because of the sheer amount of different ways that you can play the game and be effective with the tools you have at your disposal. Weapons all have specific attack patterns, damage methods, and ammo counts that you have to keep an eye on, meaning your strategy could strongly vary from run to run. Sometimes being a melee lancer with strong shields and movement could be the loadout for you. Or maybe for this run, a fast laser shooting like mouse that can't take a hit worth a damn, but can dodge almost everything could be the key to success. Each weapon type here feels different as well, and doesn't feel like some basic add-on to a default everything gun, meaning that you have to learn how that specific weapon fires and how to best use it in tight corridors or even out in the vastness of space. The combinations of the weapons, objectives, and enemy types here allows for a very adaptive difficulty, either putting you behind the 8-ball and on the defensive, or feeling like a badass ripping through a level. Someone on Steam used the term tough but fair here, and I think that's the best description that I can give Cryptarch. Yeah, you will die, you will struggle, but you never feel like the game screwed you with RNG. And that's thanks to the real highlight of the game, the planning of your scavenging. Sure, I told you about the loadout portion of the game, but at the start of each section, you have to choose which ship that you're going to salvage, and that decision is vastly important. You'll also need to take into account the side objectives that can earn you more money with this decision, which can vastly alter a run due to a need for speed or a specialization that you may not have. Some of them you'll need to avoid because you don't have the right equipment, for example. Others, you'll need to take some risks on because guess what? There's only so many objectives the game has. And the game shows you everything beforehand layout-wise, allowing you to make your battle plan before you get in. In fact, the heist-like nature of planning your route is the addictive part here, as the different modules such as Repair, which fix other broken modules, or a teleporting module that may take your objective away from you, will need to be taken into account, and you may have to adapt on the fly when something goes wrong. Really, the only thing that holds Cryptarch back is that you're not going to get 30 plus hours of gameplay here unless you're a dedicated roguelike or roguelite perfectionist and get really addicted to the gameplay cycle. But for most people, it's more like 15 to 20 hours of gameplay. But those 15 to 20 hours are going to be an experience that you won't regret. And considering it's 65% off during this winter sale, I better see that 57K number rise. Number 1. Danganronpa B3 Killing Harmony. I know. Trust me, I know. How is a game that got mainstream coverage ending up as my most overlooked game of 2017? One that did well critically. Hell, even I didn't consider it for this video up until the last few moments, where the games at my number 10 slot at that point were so close that I was having a problem just giving one of them the nod. So, on a whim, I decided to check the Steam Spy numbers of the games that I played this year. And well, imagine my shock when one of my games in the top 5 of my Game of the Years for this year ended up in this list. Now look, that was the same last year with Valhalla, which was number 1 of course, but Danganronpa B3 is a bit more known of a franchise. Now, you may argue that the PS4 numbers aren't released, and it probably did sell well there, but considering it launched on the PC, you would also expect good numbers for a highly anticipated sequel. And as of December 24th, 2017, it's got less than 50,000, which is insane in my mind, because it's one of the highest rated scores I've ever given on this channel. Look, I'm not gonna apologize for being a Danganronpa fanboy. The Danganronpa series is known for its twists and its crazy, insane world, but there's so much more to this series than its shock value. And V3 took the series to new heights with a cast of characters that up and down the board are fascinating to follow. From an insane inventor with a masochistic side along with a naughty tongue, to a gentle giant who loves insects but could crush anyone near him like an insect. These character interactions are fascinating, as the various relationships and rivalries that develop are compelling with a whole heap of emotions. That's at the core of the storytelling within Danganronpa B3, which you may say to me, okay Dragnix, any good story gets emotion out of you. And you're absolutely right. But V3 blew my high expectations out of the water and delivered a story that has so many layers and is so deep that I really just couldn't handle it at the end. Yes, I cried on several occasions. Yes, I laughed my ass off on several occasions. And that's a sign of a game that's really effective. On top of that, gameplay enhancements to the cases do help with new minigames such as the Mass Panic Debate and the Debate Scrum. And there's some really good post-game content added to the universe, with past characters able to mix with a new cast in a board game-like setting. But in the end, Danganronpa is all about its crazy world and its story. The themes of hope versus despair, the ideas of lies versus the truth, and the idea of what a person may do when pushed to the limit. And they are all fascinating to watch here. The writing quality of V3 is fantastic, and the game in particular has some of the best voice performances in the entire series, on both the English and Japanese side of things. To some, the ending is controversial, but to me, it actually can fit into the series rather nicely. Let me also be frank, you expect twists in a series like this, and this is where V3 shines, because it knows that. It knows that fans of the franchise are going to have certain expectations, and it's gonna keep them guessing. And it's also gonna keep people who are coming into this new guessing as well. You won't see things coming until that one moment where you get that one piece of evidence and you realize that oh shit, that's where they're going. V3 is one of the best experiences I've had this year, and for it to be overlooked like it has been, well, that's just a goddamn shame. And that's it for this year's list. I'd like to wish everyone a happy new year going into 2018, and I hopefully have found a formula to be able to bring you guys more content while being able to, you know, support myself with the other job and everything like that. Now, if there was a game that was overlooked this year that didn't make it on this list, let me know in the comments below. I will be trying to make a couple of videos on the specific games in this list, along with games like Finding Paradise in the first few months of 2018. I do want to play a little bit of catch-up, although I still want to cover new games. I will be attempting to catch up on some bigger games for my top 10 games of 2017 list, and I'm hopefully having that done in the second week or third week of January. I will try to do another video in between then, but for now, I'm just gonna try to focus on, you know, catching up on games like Odyssey. Anyway, this is Dragnix signing out, and as always, keep on gaming.